Welcome to Blockchain Island Summit 2025 on-site podcast brought to you by Provenance. My name is Sebastian Grube and I'm the co-chair of the Events and Communications Working Group at Blockchain Island. With me is Previn Singh, who is the Executive in Residence for Global Digital Finance. Previn, welcome.
Thank you very much, Sebastian.
And thank you for coming. What brought you to Blockchain Island Summit 2025?
I always welcome these opportunities to speak to people in the industry. I think it's important not to stay in your own echo chamber for too long. You know, I work in financial services, and it's very easy for me to talk about blockchain to just financial services outfits. So when the opportunity came to talk to a business school, particularly one that's international in its outlook, I couldn't say no.
Amazing. Yeah, glad to hear that. And what are some of the topics or themes or speakers that you found particularly inspiring or thoughtful today?
I think it was really interesting seeing some of the real DeFi people on the stage and some of their thoughts around how things might change. They're not as constrained as perhaps heavily regulated industries are. So hearing their points of view is genuinely very, very interesting. And in a sort of funny sort of way, it's a postcard from a possible future. So that's what I like to try and listen in on and find out what their views are.
Yeah, and kind of get the bottom-up approach almost in that sense, hearing from people on the ground.
100%, 100%.
And in your role as executive in residence for Global Digital Finance, tell us a little bit more about that. What do you do? What's your responsibilities?
So maybe I'll start with who GDF actually are, Global Digital Finance. They're a public policy and advocacy institution, and they work with financial services and governmental bodies and regulators. And they act as the connective tissue, the glue that joins those three things together. So I came across them in my previous role at Credit Suisse when I was head of digital assets and DLT, Center of Competency there. One of the things we used to do there was public policy. We used to do proofs of concepts, minimum viable products, Series A, Series B investments, and public policy. So in that public policy part of the discussion, we would get approached to comment on draft consultation papers, for example, MiCA, for example, draft version of that, and other various acts and other industry papers. So rather than have point-to-point discussions, we tend to work through the trade associations, and GDF was one of them. And from my perspective, it was one of the ones I liked working with, that had a very strong competency when it came to digital assets, and which is why I'm working with them now. So basically, they needed some help with executive in residence type input. I was available, and it ended up being a good proposition for both parties.
Amazing. And what's on the agenda for 2025? What are the goals for the rest of this year?
Yeah, I think we're going to carry on with our key thing about standardization and data standards. We want to also use our independence to bring together industry participants from across the financial services ecosystem and act as a unifying voice for certain topics. Now, the key one of these is, broadly speaking, is tokenization of real-world assets and how to reuse them for specific use cases. Can't say any more than that, but
that's fair enough. It's been a topic that's been coming up a lot for over today.
Suffice to say, it's more than simple buying and selling of tokenized assets. It's actually doing other things with them. Hopefully, things that the rest of the ecosystem will find useful too. So it's really acting as a way to bring together various participants who may have eventually end up speaking to each other, but this actually catalyzes and speeds up the whole process.
Amazing, yeah. And that's been another theme, is this idea of collaboration and multiple parties talking to each other. When you're talking about the ecosystem, tell me a little bit more about what you mean by that.
So I've spent most of my time working for sell-side institutions, so banks like Deutsche Bank, Credit Suisse, Goldman Sachs, Morgan Stanley. Now, you could start the blockchain conversation amongst your own peer group, but it'd all be sell-side, really. So in order to broaden that out into beginnings of an ecosystem, we work with what we call the buy side. So large institutional fund managers, for example, BlackRock, PIMCO, for example, Fidelity. We also then work with central securities depositories like DTCC. We work with exchanges like LSEG, London Stock Exchange Group. So that gives you a feel for what we mean by ecosystem. It's not just buyers and sellers, it's intermediaries in between. But also, it's worth mentioning also specialist input from legal firms, for example, or public policy outfits like GDF, trade bodies, regulators. You know, we try and bring together the broadest ecosystem possible in order to come up with an outcome that works for everyone.
And how do the DeFi kind of natives play a role in that ecosystem and in those conversations?
Yeah, so they're most definitely part of that as well. So we look at working with those guys as well and bringing them into this, mostly in the guise of fintechs, actually. And that's probably the sort of optimum way of doing that. We do work with some really cutting edge DeFi players, mostly through education, learning type forums. But yeah, really, it's through the fintech aspect that we entrain their knowledge and their expertise from their particular domain into ours.
Amazing. Yeah. And I think education is so important. So that's always the foundation in that sense. Where do you see the application of blockchain technology in the real world application? And what do you think is still hype in the space at this point?
So where I see its application is wherever there are frictions and pain points that aren't being addressed by traditional ways of doing things. So every time you do a transaction in banking, for example, investment banking, and it takes a day to settle, or 2 days in some instances, there's an opportunity there. Every time you do a primary issuance and it takes you 9 months to a year to do the due diligence, again, there's an opportunity there. So I think there are certain use cases along those lines. And I know that sounds very abstract, but I'll give you an example. It might take US equities 1 day to settle. Now, using a private permission blockchain, you could bring that down to minutes. Now, if you're dealing with tokenized equities, that's great. That's happened very quickly. If you're dealing with really large ticket collateral transfers, high quality liquid assets like bonds, the ticket sizes are much, much larger. So the capital you set aside for 1 day, 2 days is also going to be larger too. So if you can get into that space, tokenize a high quality liquid asset and use it as a repo or for securities financing, for example, you have the potential to save quite a lot of money because the ticket size is so large, the capital saved is really large. So I think those are sorts of use cases we try and get involved with. So there's 2 ways of looking at the savings that are achievable. The first is simple operational savings in terms of operational expense. We don't have to reconcile so much. There's not as many people involved. And those are definitely valid. But there are some pretty chunky savings involved when it comes to capital saves. So those are 2 broad sort of areas.
And I think that's a great perspective. We didn't have that today yet. So thank you for adding that.
Okay.
When we're sitting here again, or if we're sitting here again next year, in a year's time, what do you hope has changed in the space?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I'd like to see initiatives that are in the market that are more collectivist in their undertaking. So not just 1 or 2 participants coming up with a mini ecosystem. I'm kind of keen to see a real ecosystem developing with scale and volume, because at the end of the day, this is a network play. And what I mean by that is every time you have a new member join and use a network, that new member isn't just 1 times more useful or twice as useful. It's more like 2 squared or 3 squared. So I'm hoping we get those economies of scale that come from the network effect in about a year's time. So yeah, really, it's really my sort of sincere sort of wish to see a year from now endeavors that are much broader, across a much broader network than simple, small scale ecosystems.
Let's hope to make that happen. Previn, thank you so much. It was a pleasure chatting with you. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Sebastian. Thanks.